Good evening, everybody. And thank you for the welcome. It's a great joy for me to be back in Vancouver. 46 years ago, I paid my first visit. And that was in the heady days of the 60s, the time of Martin Luther King, of the "We shall overcome" of civil rights, of thousands going to San Francisco with flowers in their hair, of Dylan's "Times That Are Changing," of Vietnam War protests and Pete Seeger's searing question, "Where have all the flowers gone?" Of Eleanor Rigby's leaving home, of Beatles fame, and so much else. People were hallucinating via the media of LSD and marijuana about a world where love would reign supreme. And we were invited to imagine that there was no heaven and there was no hell. Rather, everyone living on this earth in harmony. It was quite an intoxicating time to be alive, especially if you were young. And there was a huge optimism based on the belief that it really was possible to change things. And to some extent, it was. The songs of the 60s were the voice of a huge social consciousness, and we owe an enormous debt to those who incarnated the more challenging lyrics, and whose lives became the melody, often at great cost to themselves. I was studying, as Denise has indicated, at the U of T for a master's in social work, and because I was on a scholarship, that did not permit me to travel home during the 2 years. I instead found myself part of a very exciting pilot project here in Vancouver's inner city. Retrospective guidance is a great thing, but I really do believe that this was one of the very formative periods of my life, and I have always been grateful. I loved Canada. Not just saying that because I'm here, I really did. And I might have settled here had it not been for a quite relentless invitation that was given not once, but 3 times for me to return to Northern Ireland to work with a man who was then university chaplain at Queen's in Belfast, and who was in the process of founding the Corrymeela Community, a Christian organization dedicated to peace and reconciliation. His name was Ray Davey, and his request was that I work with him on the university chaplaincy team, although at that stage I had no theological training. That was 1968, what some historians now call the year of revolution. Certainly, unrest about stagnant justice issues was bubbling close to the surface in many different places, and students were to the fore as civil rights activists. Little did I or Ray Davey know that after a few exciting months when we all felt we were working together for a better Ireland and a better world, the situation in the little northeastern corner of the island, known as Northern Ireland and part of the United Kingdom, would have degenerated into a spiral of violence that was to shape and mold most of our adult lives and lead us along paths we never imagined we would take. 30 years later, a peace agreement was negotiated out of what had in essence been a civil war. And for the last 15 years, we have been seeking to walk out a peace process that is fragile and vulnerable, but one for which, nonetheless, we are profoundly grateful. It is not my remit this evening to give you a potted history of our conflict. And if I even attempted it, you would probably be much more confused by the time I'd finished. In fact, sometimes I think those of us who have been raised on it with our mother's milk, as it were, still do not understand the intricacies, the depths, the ancestral drumbeats, and at times the irrationality of the implosions and the explosions that became normal living for so many years for a population of just 1.5 million. In such a situation, people react differently. Their reactions fueled by their experiences or their desire to be part of the group. Some build walls, others build bridges. For the privileged minority who were upwardly mobile, there was another choice: to leave altogether or to deliberately commit themselves to remaining and seeing it through. I happen to be in the latter category. I claim no plaudits for so doing. Suffice to say, in all humility, it was as if I and others had been seized by a hand of destiny. And as Dag Hammarskjöld, one-time Secretary General of the United Nations, famously said, "Weep if you must, but do not complain. The way chose you, and you must be thankful." When I was in Canada, I came across words of an American philosopher, Josiah Royce, and they have remained as a sort of touchstone for me throughout all the years. He said this: "I believe in the beloved community, and in the spirit that makes it beloved, and in the communion of all who are, in will and in deed, its members. I see no such community as yet. Nonetheless, my rule of life is act so as to hasten its coming." The question is, how can we hasten the coming of that for which we yearn? And perhaps that is what this talk is about this evening. I would not presume to try to tell you how you should address the situations from which you come. All I can do is to share some of the treasures that I and others have mined from the dark places of conflict and its aftermath, in the hopes that you will find some resonances there for yourselves. Ray Davy used to remind us that Jesus never ever said, "Blessed are the peace lovers." He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This world has got far too many armchair pundits for peace, but too few of those who are willing, as children of God, to embark on such a messy and a costly journey. Jean Vanier often speaks of what he sees as the three realities in life. You'll have heard him say this, many of you, before, but I feel it bears repeating many times. The first is the reality of hatred, dominated by sadism and responsible for much of the cruelty in the world. The second is the tyranny of the normal, dominated by fear and characterized by the deafening silence of the good people. And the third is the trickle of the peacemakers. He then poses the question as to what it is that tips someone over from the tyranny of the normal into the trickle of those who work for peace. And he concludes that it's not so much something you decide to do as something that is done to you. I would wholeheartedly concur with that, with perhaps the postscript that you do have to be in some place of awareness in order for the tipping over to take place. The chief reason we anesthetize ourselves and remain caught in normality is fear. Fear of the unknown. Even in the trickle, it is so easy to be seductively lured back to the tyranny of the normal. At the height of our conflict, there was a song that, while being very funny, had an underlying challenge that spoke volumes. And I do apologize to the interpreters, because there is no way, unless they are absolutely superhuman, that they're going to be able to translate this. But bear with me. I'm not going to sing it, but part of the song went like this. Whatever you say, say nothing when you talk about you know what. For if you know who could hear you, you know what you'd get. For they'd take you off to you know where, for you wouldn't know how long. So for you know whose sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song. And you all know what I'm speaking of when I mention you know what. And I think it's very dangerous to mention even that. For the other ones are always near, although you may not see. And if anyone asks who told you that, please don't mention me. I worked for 3 years at the university in a Belfast that, due to bombs and bullets, livelihoods wrecked and lives shattered, was rapidly changing out of all recognition. Fear stalked the streets, and peace seemed to be an elusive dream. All indications were that we were in this for the long haul. So I went to Edinburgh to study theology, applied to be a candidate for ordination within the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, knowing that at that time no denomination in Ireland accepted women for such a role, and after much debate and many struggles, was ordained in 1976. The reason was that I felt that there was a need for some people who were trained not only in community development, as I had been, but also in theology, because of the particular nature of what was happening to us. Many simplistically have called our conflict a religious war. Ordination back then was a secondary aim for me, but retrospective guidance again, God had it in hand. I ministered, as Denise has also indicated, for nearly 14 years in a large housing project on the edge of Belfast, a place that manifested all the drumbeats of the conflict, including the paramilitary activity that was fueled by deep sectarianism and bigotry. To be involved in anything that smacked of reconciliation or peace in such an area was almost immediately suspect. But the call was there and could not be ignored. Quietly, we began to build some bridges and explore some pathways to peace. In 1988, Restoration Ministries, the organization for which I still work, was born, arising out of those experiences. And by 1991, I came out of parish ministry to be a full-time pilgrim with this little movement. The main thrusts of the movement are healing and reconciliation. And these are outworked in various ways, primarily by providing a safe place where people can come and tell their story and be heard, and by creating various opportunities where people can meet one another across the increasing number of divides that constitute today's society and simply build friendship. We are non-denominational and take our name from the 23rd Psalm, "He restores my soul." That little statement of faith resonates with the outrageous hope that it is He, the Lord, who causes life to return. My life, the life of our community and our nation. And the heartbeat of all that we seek to do and to be is prayer. And while I will not be singling it out as a pathway, throughout all that I say, I hope that you will sense that prayer is the fragrance that permeates all paths. It is what enables us to set out in the first place, and it is what enables us to keep on with hope. Jeremiah, prophesying from an aching heart just prior to the exile, issues a warning that if the people of his beloved land do not turn from their rebellion, destruction will come upon them. And at one point in his passionate plea, he says this: "Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not walk in it. That is not the road we want." The pathways to peace are ancient ones, tried and tested, and often conveniently forgotten. But together they form the good way, one that bears the hallmarks of mercy, justice, truth, and peace. And the promise is that if we choose such a route, we will find rest, that inner peace upon which all other lasting peace depends. The psalmist also gives the assurance that he will guide us along the right paths because he is true to his name. All of this implies, of course, a willingness, an openness to walking the walk, perhaps more than talking the talk. Phil Cousineau, in a book, The Art of Pilgrimage, describes the pilgrim as a curious soul who walks beyond known boundaries, crosses fields, touching the earth with a destination in mind and a purpose in heart. Armed with a holy curiosity, holding before us a paradoxically unknown but infinitely knowable destination, and equipped with a purpose that is more about it of endurance than any kudos or fleeting glory, we are ready to start out. Throughout the years, we have identified several pathways to peace that, taken together, comprise the good way. You will no doubt have others. For us, in a little and often hidden manner, they have given glimpses of the beloved community. And there are times when one takes precedence over the other, depending upon particular circumstances. Paradoxically, they may all be traveled at the same time, converging paths on the highway to peace. I am somewhat reticent to put them in any order of priority, but after many years of pilgrimage, the one I feel called to highlight first is simply that of being attentive to one's own inner journey. I am totally convinced that the biggest peacemaking journey I will ever make is the one within myself. We are all members of the human race. We start with a common humanity which implies acceptance and inclusion. And the only way that we can genuinely welcome another and convey to them that they belong is if we ourselves have that sense of belonging, of welcome, of being the beloved planted within our own beings. I find this probably the most difficult to talk about, not because I am reluctant, but because my whole being is straining to impart something that is absolutely central to everything else that we seek to do or to be, especially in the whole area of peacemaking. Christopher Fry has described our world as this great orphanage where no one knows his name and no one comes to claim him. Over the last few months in Northern Ireland, sporadic violence has again flared, ostensibly over a decision from Belfast city councillors to fly the Union flag only on certain specified days and not continuously as previously. Behind all the facade, even sometimes the aggression and thinly veiled anger and suspicion, there often hides a person who has never discovered who they really are, and so will cling to the external identity of their group and defend it against all comers, rather than face the nothingness that they feel within. It could be said that for certain sections of our community, this, and not the issue of a flag, is the underlying motivation for the violence and the conflict and the protests. No true inner sense of identity, alienation, fear of the unknown, the shame of non-being. If these cannot or will not be addressed, then such unexplored or unidentified monsters do not go away, but instead are turned outwards in scapegoating, violence, and anger. And the orphan syndrome remains. But we can recognize those sort of feelings within ourselves as well, can't we? We may not express them in the same way, but they are real nonetheless. We constantly try to make it easier for ourselves by identifying ourselves with a group and by labeling others as them, those who are part of their particular box. That sort of activity can lead to dehumanization of the other, and from that, it is a frighteningly short step to demonization, where all actions become legitimate. And what many end up doing is to scapegoat themselves, leading to a crippling self-condemnation, even self-hatred. Underneath, where no one else can see, there hides something of the orphan in all of us. We too can have an address, but never truly know ourselves at home in that place of intimacy, of lover and beloved. The way we love our neighbor, whoever that neighbor may be, reflects the way we love ourselves. It's as simple and as basic and as perplexing as that. To accept the fact that we are loved and to pick up the vocation to be loved require a new way of seeing, a huge humility and a generosity of spirit towards ourselves. In essence, they require our world, our inner world, to be turned upside down. God sees us, the real you and me. He knows us and he loves us. Beloved is not just an adjective, a descriptive word, beautiful as that is. If you break it down, it's also a command. Be loved. The further I journey in life, the less I know. But the more I become aware of mystery, and perhaps specifically this mystery of being loved, the fact, the awareness, the invitation, and the challenge. I am convinced that this is the most radical gospel call of all, and the one which we resist most strongly. If we truly grasped it, if we became aware of it even a little, then this world and the communities from which we come would be very different. The secret lies in being willing to climb down, to be willing to go on that inner journey, and to realize that, yes, in the secret place where lurk the fears, the anxieties, and the grudges that we clutch so tightly to ourselves, there is also a hidden place of intimacy where there can be that meeting of lover and beloved. And that is a form of prayer. And whenever I risk enough to open myself up to that one, when I consent to the dismantling of the peace wall within, when the inner exile begins the long pilgrimage towards the home of their true self, I will find a whole new interior welcome, a unity in diversity. And unity is simply diversity embraced by love. As I allow myself, in all my inner diversity, to be embraced by love, then I gradually become a dwelling place for the beloved, and life will never be the same, even although that too is only the beginning, for there's always more. And the inner reflects the outer. As the walls come down on the inside, there is almost simultaneously a dismantling of the obstacles to community on the outside. Some of you who are part of Faith and Light may remember Father Joseph Larson. Anybody remember him? After spending many years in the Philippines as a missionary priest, he then worked among the homeless in Paris, living with the barest of essentials on a barge on the River Seine. At the same time, he was international chaplain to Faith and Light, and he now lives in a home for retired priests in Holland. He is such an icon of peace, stemming from his being true to his inner journey. And that commitment is now worked out in littleness, the obscurity and the frustrations of a community of elderly priests. Long ago, he gave up the illusion that he was in control of his life and surrendered all to the great lover. In his last letter, which someone else had to type for him, he said this: "This is a time of Advent. At the same time, it is a constant presence in humble restoration ministry among old people with their idiosyncrasies. My journey is marked by the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. That is why I cannot write by hand anymore, added by many other inconveniences, but the heart is still so awake." Notice he does not say, "I have Parkinson's disease." He refuses to let himself be boxed. By that simple, courageous statement, he is affirming that he is more than the disease, with all its attendant indignities and frustrations. He is still on a journey of greater and greater abandonment to the beloved, and his heart is alert, aware, awake for the slightest whisper from the God who is still so in love with him. There is no turning back or aside for Joseph Larson, though most people have forgotten him. But already he is on the verge of the great awakening. And whenever he steps across the threshold, it will not be to a strange country, but rather to one whose landmarks are so familiar because he has lived them all of his earthly life. Running parallel, but also wending its way backwards and forwards across that first pathway, is the pathway of listening. Most of us live in a very noisy world, so many voices clamoring for our attention. And we also carry a lot of our own baggage with us, so that what we hear, first of all, goes through the particular sieve of our own life experience and can feed a preformed bias or opinion. These and other impediments can lead to a superficial or selective listening that does not do justice to those who have a right to be heard. This right applies to God, to self, to the other, and indeed to the whole created order. And once again, the practice of letting go is so vital in order that we might be free to be fully in the now of the one who needs to be heard. To be fully present, to pay total attention, is hard work and is not for the faint-hearted. Those who have a story to tell, and that's all of us at one point or another, are not so much looking for answers, but for the assurance that someone has heard them, has acknowledged their cry, has listened beyond their words to the silent scream, has awarded them the dignity and the respect of recognizing that such an encounter warrants a metaphorical removing of shoes, for this is holy ground. This is true for individuals, for communities, and indeed for whole nations. People are never, ever going to be able to leave their particular burden down and move on to new beginnings unless they know that such a dynamic is present. The relief, even sometimes the transformation, apparent in those who know that they've been heard, taken seriously, is often palpable and always humbling. I never tire of telling Mickey's story, and indeed I've made a little covenant with myself that wherever I go on this earth, I will tell something of his story. He was one of a family of 10. When he was 11 years old, his father died. His mother's nerves were stretched to the limit, coping with her husband's death, living in an area controlled by paramilitaries, and looking after her 10 children. One night there was a gun battle in the high-rise apartment block in which they lived. A young British soldier was shot outside her door, and Jean went to comfort this dying boy. A couple of weeks later, a hooded gang came to her apartment and took her away, leaving her children crying after her. It later emerged that the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, had abducted her, accusing her of being an informer. Her family never saw her again. Some days later, her purse and her rings were handed in. She became known as one of the disappeared, and that was only the beginning of a nightmare that lasted for many years for those who were left behind. The family were split up, being sent to various institutions, some of which left a lot to be desired. And no one ever came forward with any further information. About 25 years after her disappearance, there began a series of authorised digs, authorised by both the government of the UK and the government of the Republic of Ireland, in a delayed attempt on the part of the authorities to discover the remains of some of the disappeared and return them to their families for burial. It was round about that time that I met Mickey. His real story had never been told, and anything that had found its way into the popular media had been manipulative and fabricated. And so I asked him if he would like to come to the relative security of our centre and speak at one of our monthly gatherings, and that I would interview him so that he would only give voice to that which he wanted others to hear. Here was a young man who had practically no formal education, who had never spoken in public before, but as he began to respond to my questions, the listeners were on the edge of their seats, tears pouring down their faces as they put a human face on that which had been for them a long since forgotten news bulletin of yet another casualty of war. The extraordinary thing was that while he spoke, I could see an actually visible change taking place within him. He physically straightened up inside of himself. He was being heard. A few days later, we arranged for him to go on to a Sunday magazine radio program. They gave him an unheard of 20-minute slot of airtime where he spoke his truth and released the outcome. And from that time on in Restoration Ministries, we began to pray that if there was no information forthcoming about the whereabouts of the bodies of all of the disappeared, then we prayed very specifically that the earth itself would yield up its dead. And that is exactly what happened. In August 2003, a man out walking on a beach stumbled over a bone, and Jean's remains were recovered. There is much, much more to this remarkable story, but the impetus given by being heard cannot be overemphasized. Today, Mickey is for me and for many an ambassador of hope, an image bearer of forgiveness, and an icon of integrity. Peace requires huge attitude change. Attitudes are about hearts and minds, and hearts and minds are changed through the building of relationships. And this is one of the most challenging and rewarding of the pathways to peace. It is no quick and easy fix. It takes years of keeping on, without many visible results in the short term. As we journey such a path, our previously clearly demarcated boundaries become gloriously blurred. Margins move to centers, confusion for a time takes the place of order, and it becomes impossible to dismiss one to whom your heart has said welcome. To live a life of hospitality, to convey the message of welcome, to be fired by a spirit of generosity requires strength and faith and courage, sometimes beyond our human endurance. Not only to seek to build bridges, but to be in oneself a bridge, to lay oneself down so that others may cross over and meet is an awesome calling. Near the Swiss-German border, there's a lake that feeds the River Rhine. It is called Untersee, but those in the know call it the Lake of Grace. In this lake is an island called Reichenau, but its preferred title is the island where the monks practice brotherhood. On the island, among the monastic ruins, you can sense the lingering fragrance of a vibrant hospitality. Life-changing relationships are in the end mystery, and are fed and nurtured by grace and hospitality at its most radical, is the heartbeat of the gospel. There's another story I never tire of telling, one of lasting friendships and ongoing hospitality and huge attitude change, and some of you will have heard me tell this before, but some 10 years into our conflict, around about 1978, I began to think how one could go about changing some of the fixed attitudes that those of differing belief systems held about one another. One example was that many people in the Republic of Ireland, when they heard the name Presbyterian, tended to lump us all together under one umbrella of Free Presbyterian, an independent church holding rather extreme religious and political views, and founded by one Ian Paisley, of whom some of you may have heard. It was summertime, and a friend and I decided to go on holiday around the island of Ireland, and instead of staying in hotels and guest houses, we decided to stay in monasteries and convents, in the basic belief that when you break bread with another, something happens. So we started out with Sacred Heart Sisters in Dublin. We moved to the Cistercians in County Waterford, and on our first night there, we're making our way to the guest refectory and sitting down for a meal. And as you do when you arrive in a place, you exchange pleasantries about where you come from and where you're going. And all of a sudden, this young man leant across the table and he said, "It's all very well for you nuns can get cheap accommodation." And my friend leant back and whispered, "Actually, Ruth's a Presbyterian minister." And there was a total silence, like the silence that comes after an explosion. And after the silence, then people began to talk at a totally different level. And it was wonderful. We then moved on to Carmelites in Kinsale, south of Cork, and then out to the very southwesterly tip of Ireland to a place called Ballinskelligs, to the holiday home for the Presentation Sisters of County Cork and County Kerry. And it was very, 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 very basic accommodation, and we had a ball. And then we moved up to County Clare. I had never been in County Clare, and the only thing that I knew about it was a song that one of our well-known songwriters, Percy French, had written as a sort of slight to the County Clare Railway. And it was a song called "Are You Right There, Michael, Are You Right?" And one of the lines went, "You're in luck when you reach Innistimon, for all the way home is downhill." Well, we were headed for Innistimon. And we arrived on a Saturday evening at the convent of the Mercy Sisters next door to the Catholic Church and Presbytery. We were only in for about half an hour when the telephone rang, and one of the sisters came to me and she said, "It's for you." And I said, "But I don't know anybody in County Clare." But I went anyway, and it was the local curate from next door, and he said, "We heard you were here. Would you do the homily in the morning?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm on holiday." And my friend jumped up and down beside the phone and said, "Say yes." So I said yes, and the next morning went out to what in my memory was a huge church packed to the doors. And the way he introduced us was, "Some of you may think Protestants have horns, but there are two here today to prove that they haven't." And then when I was about to go out to begin the homily, he whispered these words of inspiration in my ear, loud enough for the whole church to hear. "Keep it short. It's the semi-finals in Thurles." Semi-finals Gaelic football. We then went on up to the Benedictines in Kylemore Abbey and Connemara, and then back home. The point of telling that story is that throughout all the years since then, those relationships have held. They've led to others, which have led to others, resulting in a whole network of friendship throughout the island of those who, while holding different political viewpoints, living different cultures and practicing their faith in different ways, have yet found something that transcends difference and bears witness to the oneness that is already ours, namely our identity in Christ. We now see things differently, which is one meaning of repentance, because of these precious friendships. And together, we have a destination in mind and a purpose in heart. I have always been moved by accounts from the Algerian church, now diminishing but remaining faithful. And as they seek to live alongside their Muslim brothers and sisters, they practice what they call the sacrament of encounter. Isn't that lovely? The sacrament of encounter. The sacrament lies in the relationship established with the other, a relationship that becomes a source of life for both. It was such encounters that Christian de Chergé and his brothers at Tiberine lived, and it was their commitment to such relationships that persuaded them to remain in Algeria, and eventually that commitment led to their death. Christian believed that in every human face there are glimpses of God, even in the worst of them. And in his last testament, which he wrote 2 years before his death, and in which he greets the unknown who would kill him, he spells adieu with a hyphen that indicates a journeying towards God. And he called his last will and testament, "When adieu takes on a face." The end of it goes like this: "And also you, the friend of my final moment, who would not be aware of what you were doing. Yes, I also say this thank you and this adieu to you, in whom I see the face of God. And may we find each other, happy good thieves in paradise, if it pleases God, the Father of us all. Inshallah." If you think about it, I'm sure you will agree that nearly every day in our respective callings in our communities, we are presented at least with the possibility of such a sacrament of encounter in terms of the Algerian Church's definition. Through the grace and the mercy of God, we are enabled to see the face of God in one another, and especially in those who are very different from us. This is a huge gift. And I am sure that for you, as for me, it will not have come without a struggle, as we have often with a certain degree of resistance allowed ourselves to be stretched and changed. The daily celebration of such a sacrament leads us nearer to that beloved community for which we yearn. These and many other pathways to peace are permeated with a spirit of generosity, humility, and compassion, and with a recognition of the collegiality of the feet of clay. Again and again, we are challenged to tap into the power of going beyond what is expected of us. And such a challenge almost inevitably presents us with the crisis of forgiveness. If you like, of letting ourselves and God, or the image we have of God, off the hook. To talk about in any depth about such a process would take many days, but suffice to say, this is not something that can be forced or demanded. It is a journey. It is a decision, And only those who have lived the reality of their pain can know when the time is right to set out on such a pilgrimage. It is about letting go, about forgiving, giving something before. In making the decision and in embarking upon the journey, we enter into a new freedom where we can remember without the sting. Jean Vanier often says, community is founded on forgiveness and builds itself up through love. It's how we free ourselves from the past, and it is so important for our own health and well-being, both individually and collectively, and for the power, I believe, that is released in the unseen world all about us when such a step is taken. For in the end, like so much else, forgiveness is a mystery. We cannot plumb its depths, and we cannot measure its effects. It's not the same as reconciliation, which latter takes two. Reconciliation is something about walking together again. And its four major players are mercy, justice, truth, and peace. They are in constant movement. The game is fragile, and if one drops out, then a vital member is missing. The results can be partially helpful, but may not be enduring. The question of a shared future still overshadows us in Ireland, as I sense it does you here too in a different way in Canada. For those who commit themselves to searching for the relevant pathways to peace, there is inevitably a price to pay. In many situations, we incur misunderstanding, even rejection, because we have been gifted with the agony of seeing beyond, and therefore often cannot take sides. We will often find ourselves in the loneliness of a no man's land, no longer part of any group. Love can lead us to unfamiliar places, to different ways of seeing, to uncomfortable insights, to risking the loss of other things and people that we have held dear. It can challenge our comfort zones, disturb our peace, widen our horizons, and sometimes take us where we don't want to go. And we can be so seductively lured back to settling for an uneasy peace, so long as we're okay. We can so easily heed the voices of those who are trapped in the tyranny of the normal. God isn't going to wave a magic wand and take us to a land of promise, but I do believe that his whisper is recognizable to anyone who is in the process of becoming aware, who heeds the call to let go, to consent to his presence and action within, that point where transformation begins. How do we fulfill our destiny as the family of God in all our diversity? How do we move towards the beloved community within our own individual inner beings, within the church, within Ireland, within this great nation of Canada? Is it pie in the sky to somehow dare to believe that mutual friendship and love is possible in the fragmentation that is me, the fragmentation that is the church, the fragmentation that is our respective countries? Is it too late to hope for a generosity of spirit, a compassion, a bent towards mercy, a walking together, a mutual letting go of ancient wrongs, real or imagined, for the sake of this moment, this now, this God-given moment, which is all any of us has, all we have, and yet enough. Enough if we truly believe in this God-man who walks through our world longing for intimacy, who pauses by our individual and collective life with his challenge of love, and is willing to go through passion and death that we might know that transformation is possible. It challenges me not only to walk the path towards peace, but in myself to become a pathway, along with countless others who, as they pass on the baton, would say, in the words of one of our famous Irish poets, "Tread softly, for you tread on my dreams." And if it all seems a bit too overwhelming, and we just want to put our heads down and hide, let me encourage you by saying that we don't have to be doing big, grandiose acts. It is, I believe, the day of small things. And God is so expert at taking the little and multiplying the effect 1,000-fold. One small flame is all it takes to let the darkness know it cannot win. I'd like to give you one final little example and then share a little reflection that I wrote out of the example to finish with. Ireland and the Irish love anniversaries, especially if they're anniversaries of fights and battles and bloody conflicts. In fact, G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "For the great gales of Ireland were the people God made mad, for all their wars were merry and all their songs were sad." And we've got a song about everything. Everything. Well, in 1798, there was an uprising or a rebellion, and it's known as the Rebellion of the United Irishmen. And that was the last time in Irish history when Presbyterians and Catholics really stood together. They formed this band of United Irishmen to try and have a united Ireland that was separate from England. So in Restoration Ministries, we were wondering what we could do, not to commemorate a rebellion, because that wouldn't be very Christian, but to remember a time when a friendship had existed and to try to nurture that friendship in the present day. So we came up with a little project which we called A Hand of Friendship. And the idea was simply to encourage people from one tradition to invite people from the other tradition into their home for a simple meal or a cup of coffee, again in the basic belief that when you break bread, something special happens. So I wrote, it was before the days when I could use a computer, I hand wrote to every Catholic bishop and every Presbyterian peace agent in Ireland, inviting them to a breakfast launch of this little project. We contacted all the conceivable media in the island and were geared up for our breakfast. Needless to say, we didn't hear from all the people that I wrote to, but we went ahead with it. On the night before that breakfast took place, two young men, a Presbyterian and a Catholic, who had been friends all their lives, were meeting for a drink in a pub near the border, when a gang of masked men burst in and shot them both dead. That was such an horrific event, and of course, all the publicity about our event went out the window because of this dreadful happening. We went ahead with it anyway, and a few months later launched it a second time, this time for the women of Ireland. Where's Ingrid? The Manana Heron. The interesting thing is that we still get phone calls from people saying either we've done it or We'd like to do that, but we don't know any Protestants or we don't know any Catholics. Could you put us in touch with some of them? Which is a sad reflection on the work that still needs to be done. However, out of that, I wrote this little reflection with which I close. If your heart is for peace, and my heart is for peace, give me your hand. Give me your hand. So small a thing to ask, and yet so big. If I let my hand touch, grasp, clasp your hand, then somehow I have crossed the Rubicon. I cannot be the same. I cannot be the same if in the clasping of your hand I dare to raise my head and look into your eyes and see there a mirror image of myself, frightened of trusting, fearful of the unknown, scared to admit your humanity, lest I am invaded, taken over, lest all they have told me over centuries proves to be true about you. Give me your hand. Oh, give me your hand before the moment passes, before the darkness overtakes, and I discover, when it is too late, that you were my sister, you were my brother, that together we were being called towards a future bright with hope and promise by the God whose hand forever reaches out to you and me in friendship, and because of whom we can never be the same. And so, may the peace of Christ be with you, and may he ever flow between us as I give you my hand. Thank you.
You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God.
Okay, you're turning to someone now.
You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God.
Turn to someone else.
You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God.
Turn to somebody behind you.
You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God.
This is for you now.
You are the face of God.